These chairs are innately oppressive. I've been thinking a lot about Job recently. Job's actually one of my favorite books of the Bible. It's terribly relatable and like wickedly funny. And at least in the tradition that I come out of, it's tragically misunderstood. Like my senior pastor, like to this day, when he quotes Job 3:25, he's like, oh, this is why you shouldn't allow fear to enter you, because that's how bad things happen when you allow yourself to be afraid. Or like he'll quote Job 2:11-13 and be like, isn't it great that Job has friends who will visit him when things aren't going well? Just like, which is funny when you know the story of Job, which we'll go through. And I wish I was joking, but unfortunately, I think that maybe a lot of us come from traditions that don't really know how to talk about this book. Chances are, you don't probably have a lot of experience with the book of Job. And those who tend to read it are either, seminarians or edgelords or just nerds, right? But to me, the book of Job talks about something that is extremely important to our understanding of our relationship with God. And I don't think that it's an accident that Job has found itself on the list of texts that are kind of hard to preach. In fact, I think there's a pretty specific reason why this book and others are hardly ever touched by our churches. Preachers, teachers, reverends, whatever. Modern day Protestantism seems to have developed a speaking model that needs to contain a digestible message to congregants that range from age 6 to 90, the non-Christian visitor and the scholar, the literate and the literal writer. For most churches, there are three models for teaching the Bible: topical, textual, and expository. Now, I don't really want to get into the tired discussion churches and theologians get into of which one is the best or most appropriate for this postmodern, post-Christian era. But I do want to comment that regardless of the one that you pick, it's essentially just different approaches to the same thing, right? Usually it's a dude standing up on a pulpit telling you something he thinks something means. Oftentimes, this comes with a practical application, but primarily it's about delivering truth in one direction, from the pulpit to the congregation. Sermons have, historically, been a great way to communicate the message of the gospel to innumerable amounts of people of all different levels. In some ways, at least in the beginning, feels almost democratic. The knowledge that was once inaccessible to those who lacked the means to have a formal rabbinic education, or like if you were a woman, were barred from much of the inner workings of Scripture. In engaging with all, the high class and the plebs, the barriers that were once there have been completely removed. These days, this structure is flawed. What was once what some might argue is highly egalitarian, or God forbid, socialist in nature, has transformed into mandates from on high to down below. But why? Why did that happen? Well, comrades, I believe we've allowed a great substitution to take place. There's an interesting human phenomena that happens seemingly across languages, cultures, and disciplines. In the mid-19th century, the Impressionist painting movement started to emerge. Impressionism is a painting style that can be characterized as relatively small but distinct brush strokes, open composition, with an emphasis on depicting an accurate sort of impression of the light and how that moves, and instead of sort of trying to capture this sort of static form of how our eye accepts visual informations, showing more of the movement of that and its ever-changing qualities. The movement of the light is a major feature of the Impressionist movement, and the artists were attempting to capture the essence of what the eye perceived. Those who began the movement weren't necessarily following a set of rules or more so just trying to genuinely capture what they saw in a way that was mutable, transitory aspects of reality. What resulted was works that, though not necessarily uniform, had very similar essence in nature. It resulted in an authenticity and candor that made the works of different artists feel unified. Initially, the public and art community hated it. Art was about stills, grandeur, realism, not this pastel, bright, tasteless, unfinished scribbling, no exceptions. Once these artists were finally allowed to show their works in the salon, Louis Leroy, a critic at the time, wrote this of Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise. Impression? I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that, since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. But as we know, with time and the boldness of these artists, Impressionism blossomed into a full-fledged movement that took the art world by storm. Like you can find Impressionist paintings in waiting rooms at the dentist. It's become such a cultural phenomenon and so synonymous to what we see as art. At the time of the movement, seeing the success of these artists, soon other artists began trying to replicate the style, creating rules and absolutes out of what was once kind of organic experimentation and freedom. These days, Impressionism can be boiled down to a list of do's and don'ts that you can find on Wikipedia. The more the artists began to standardize the style, the less sincere and naive the whole thing became. Some firmly believe this quality is distinctly different than the early movement works, something that can be seen by not just the trained eye, but anyone who looks closely enough. And I think this is true, not just about Impressionism, but about everything. I think that something happens when what was once fringe and marginalized or revolutionary becomes majority. But what is that? Comrades, I will assert that what is happening is a subtle, almost imperceptible shift from a framework of uncertainty to certainty. Some of you might be thinking okay, so what does certainty have to do with any of this? What does this have to do with the church or teachings or garish French art? Calm yourselves. We'll get there. I need to set up this world for it to make sense so you can see it the way it's happening in my head. Let's define some terms. Merriam-Webster defines certainty as certainty, firm conviction that something is the case. She knew with absolute certainty that they were dead. The quality of being reliably true. There is a bewildering lack of certainty and clarity in the law. A fact that is definitely true, or an event that is definitely going to take place. An immediate transfer would be a certainty. For the purposes of this conversation, when I say certainty, I'm going to mean a second definition, that being a firm conviction about something that shifts into a view of universal truth. Again, you might be asking, so? But I feel compelled to ask, what role does certainty play in the life of a Christian? This might seem like a weird question, especially within the way American denominations function in this day and age. But I want to put a pin in that before I attempt to answer that question. Let's talk about Job. For those of you who haven't read it, Job is arguably the first book of the modern Bible written. It stars a guy named Job whose life is good. He has a wife and kids and land, and he prospers. He even makes sure to do a preliminary sin offering for his children, like just in case they sin without realizing it, right? Then, seemingly arbitrarily, God makes a deal with like someone who is challenging God's character, and it sends Job's life into like this unending spiral of darkness. And it's caused him to really have a bone to pick with God, which, yeah, I get it. I like to think of Job as a kind of dialectic, a method of philosophical argument that involves two opposing sides and their arguments rather than sort of a retelling of real world happenings. If you know anything about philosophy, that's essentially what Plato is doing with who he's characterized as his teacher, Socrates, and they're his opponents. There's also the stuff that Hegel is doing, but listen, no one cares. Anyway, throughout the book of Job, we see different characters having a discussion about the nature of the world God has made and arguing statements of perceived truth. Or, in other words, each one is certain of something. This something happens to be about God and how justice works in this world. Job has found himself in quite the predicament. His life, shambles, children, dead, riches, gutted, complexion, acne prone. And he's demanding answers from God because, as far as he can tell, he's done nothing wrong. But instead of just talking about this story, let me present it in a way that maybe might hit closer to home. Just for funsies, I kind of decided to make this kind of like a modern retelling of Job. I think sometimes when we think about biblical stories, we kind of put them in a box and we're like, oh, this is like a biblical story. I have to think about it in a certain framework. And for the nature of this, I kind of wanted you guys to just see this story as a story. So in this kind of retelling, the character of Job will be a character named Fatima, and all of Job's friends / frenemy / antagonists for this will be one character named Meryl. All right, let's do it. I wish I was dead. No, I wish I'd never been born. Just blot me out of existence. Why couldn't my dad have just pulled out? My birthday? Remove it from the calendar. September 21st, gone. Suspended animation. No more autumn equinox. Seriously, why couldn't my mom have just had a headache that night? Can you send a hex to the past? Why didn't I just die at birth? Okay. I would be at peace now, asleep, forever, no pain. Why does God even bother allowing miserable people to taste goodness? Why bother keeping bitter people alive? Just let them die. What's better than death at this point? At this point, that'll be the happiest day of my life. But no, here we are, left to contend with this miserable life. Pointless, meaningless. This is a living nightmare. A life filled with death without its release. That is a lie. I wasn't gonna say anything, but Jesus, girl, get a grip. I've never seen you like this. Usually you're the one comforting me. But when it's you, something's like cosmically wrong. You trust God, don't you? You're like a seminarian, right? It's not like you're living in the world. Bad things don't happen to good people. God is just and only punishes those who deserve it. Trouble is temporary. Only those who do wrong have any reason to fear God. Their eternal damnation is at stake after all. You have to pray, Fatima. You must call into heaven. Gosh, I've seen so many people lose their relationship with God to anger and pride. I've seen so many people be wrong about where they are in their relationship with God, only recognizing when they're too far gone. Fatima, you must ask God for forgiveness. That's what I would do if I found myself in a situation like yours. Our God is big enough for anything you give him. Your sin is not too heavy for God to handle. I know it. And what a blessing to be at the mercy of God's active wrath. You know, like John Mark Comer talks about in God Has a Name? You're the one who made me read that book. You have a chance to repent in this life. Don't despise your discipline. God is trying to deliver you. Sure, you're suffering now, but you're just on the other side of God's blessing. You're going to come through this better. God will restore all that you have lost, 200-fold. I swear. You just got to have faith for it, right? Can I pray for you? Meryl. Yes? If misery could be measured, the weight of your little speech would have pushed me off the edge. What don't you understand? This isn't about endurance. I can't take much more of this. God has literally taken a dump on my entire life. I'm not keeping quiet about this. Look at me. Look at my life. Look what God has done. At this point, all I want from God is an answer to this prayer. God, squash me out of existence and just be done with it. At least at this point, I can say I still believe in God. But at this rate, what kind of God does this to someone? I can't handle this. What, I'm supposed to pull myself up by my bootstraps? Meryl, I have nothing. I don't even have any boots. And seriously, what kind of response is that? I thought you were my friend. You say, ask for help. But how long did it take you to finally come and visit me? You've been too busy gallivanting around LA for months doing your internship with Mosaic. And this, seriously, is all you have to say? What? Is this too real for you? Did I make you uncomfortable? I'm asking you, why would God do something like this? Don't sidestep the question. If you've got something that you want to say to me, just say it, because it seems like you're trying to imply something about me, so just come out with it. Jesus, listen to yourself. How long are you going to go on like this? Does God make mistakes? Is God incapable of injustice? Look, I know your parents died or whatever. It's obvious that they sinned, otherwise why would they have been punished? Look, all you have to do is fall on your knees and prayer. If you really are as innocent as you seem to think, it's not too late. God will meet you where you're at and make everything right again. We're like young, you know? We have to look at our elders to see how they got through this stuff. There's divine order in this world. But we must not forget God. When we do, we find ourselves out of alignment. And what happens? God puts us back in line. God would never reject a good person. It's not like you're bad or anything. You'll see through this hard time. I'm not an idiot, Meryl. You're blatantly missing my point. I'm asking what I'm supposed to do in this instance where I've done nothing wrong. It's not like I can take God to court. God is infinite. God moves mountains, tells the sun not to shine, and it doesn't. Created the universe. We'll never comprehend all that God does. If God wanted to, what would stop God from robbing me blind? There's literally nothing I could say to change God's mind. Even in my innocence, how am I supposed to prove it? I'm at God's mercy. If God answers my call, that's the only way I believe God's listening. As it is, I'm just a cosmic punching bag. Who's gonna step in? You're literally proving my point. Who would believe me? It's my word against God. But it's true, and I have no idea why this is happening. The only conclusion I can come to is that God is an indiscriminate destroyer. No one is safe. God doesn't care who gets destroyed in the path of whatever God chooses to do. Clearly, I've already been charged as guilty. I have no advocate. Blah! God, at least tell me what I've done to deserve this. How is this good? How is this just? They go on like that for quite a while. So now that the scene has more or less been set, you see the problem being set up. Fatima is upset that God has made her life total and utter garbage for no reason, at least in Fatima's mind. For her, she's done all she knows to do in the sight of God, but where has it gotten her? Gutted, that's what. Meryl is trying to placate her friend with kind of these common Christian platitudes that you hear, right? And when it doesn't work, when it doesn't sort of make Fatima stop complaining so loudly about her situation, she shifts to outright blame. Obviously, Fatima has done something wrong. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Fatima just needs to confess, pray, and God'll forgive her, right? But Fatima refuses this paradigm. She knows she's done nothing wrong. And if so, God needs to be explicit about what it is that she's done wrong. In the full story, which I fully invite you to read, the argument gets kind of nasty. In an effort to assert the certainty of their argument, the antagonists in this story essentially completely vilify our main character just to justify their view of God. Need I remind you, this is their friend. This isn't just like some person they don't know. This is a person who I would assume they know their character. One even in the story, in which I included, says essentially like, hey, like, you've helped me in the past, and here are some of the things that you used to say to me. And yet you see how quickly just any notion that challenges the way that they see what they perceive as truth causes them to ignore, who knows, maybe years worth of friendship to indict this character, right? And after listening to all this nonsense, God eventually has to advocate for himself. And that's the thing. You'd think that that would be like a bigger deal in the Christian worldview. God literally comes to Job, Fatima in this retelling, and speaks directly to the issue of theodicy, why God allows suffering in the world. And Christians, for the most part, don't even touch this book. And that's because they don't like the answer. But the answer is key to my point. So, what exactly does God have to say? how does God explain God's self? Well, it's complicated. You've literally been talking about this endlessly. What are you even going to say at this point? Straighten up. I'm here now, aren't I? Now I've got some questions for you. Now, remind me. Were you there when I created the earth? You know, since you apparently know so much and was just wondering if I missed you or something. And certainly, you know who decided how big the earth would be and how it was made and all that, right? Who came up with the blueprints? Who got the project going? All while every being in existence cried out in praise. Who took charge of the ocean when it gushed forth like a baby from the womb? Me, dummy! You ever look at the sun and tell it to get up and get to work? What you know about the depths of the ocean? What you know about death? Like for real. Speak up! You done all this talking. You ain't got nothing to say now? It goes on like that for quite a while, honestly. God is just taking the time to kind of read our main character to filth, not because of, not like laying out a list of all the things that they've done, like you did this and this and this, but more so like, what do you know about anything? You know, and especially too, I love the confrontation of where I feel like God's like, speak up, dummy. I thought you were taking me to court. What's the charge? Job's like, sorry, Mom, but that is at this point, God has already come and God has some things to say, so they'll finish what they have to say. God essentially makes it abundantly clear how little our main character knows about anything. All for the purpose of making it clear that God is the one who operates existence, understands all of existence, and holds all of those complexities. And, well, you know, Job/Fatima has no choice but to concede that. And you'd think that God would just like continue to rub it in their face, right? Continue to rub it in Job's face, Job/Fatima's face. At least that's what I would do. But something more interesting happens. You're right. I really don't know much about anything, do I? I literally have no concept of what you do. Honestly, I had no concept of who you were at all, in full transparency, but I think I get it now. I'm not just saying that. Sorry. Oi, Meryl, what was that? Fatima, dear, please pray for your friend. After our main character apologizes, God just kind of shifts to talk to Meryl and be like, what was that? Like, what was that? Please ask my lovely servant Job to pray for you. Which is wild, right? Like, you'd think, I guess I feel like in my tradition, like, you'd think that God would side with the people who were trying to defend God's character, but God is like, you did a bad job. And I don't know you. I don't know her, right? I think what I love about this story is that nothing happens in the way you'd think. You have this argument between essentially two camps. The camp that thinks that Fatima did something wrong, and then Fatima attempting to advocate for herself. And you'd expect, and typically in the way that arguments work, that one of these sides would win. But nope, in the end, God comes down and tells them they're both wrong. Go to your room. But not only that, God gets kind of existential. Instead of being direct and answering the questions being asked, the response is essentially, you literal ant, piss off, I'm running the universe. Okay, I'm embellishing. But you can't argue that the speech God gives Job isn't like a firm scolding, essentially. And if you're confused and kind of pissed off, I don't blame you. I think that that's a lot of people's reaction to this story. It literally doesn't attempt to answer why these things happened aside from God allowed it. We don't even get to understand why God allowed it. And if you're a biblical literalist, I totally get why you steer away from this book. I mean, Job's kids are literally killed for the sake of the plot. But if you're reading this as more wisdom literature, I think it's fair to ask, what is the wisdom that we are supposed to be learning about this story? I would propose that one of the main takeaways from the book of Job in its efforts to answer the question of why bad things happen to good people is essentially a lot of things happen that you don't understand. Welcome to existence. Now, if you're thinking, that's a pretty shitty answer to that question, again, I don't blame you. It is if you're under the impression that human understanding is essential to how things operate within this world. In general, when we hear something we don't like or we don't get, we generally go, well, that's dumb, I don't believe that. But since when did our belief or understanding of a phenomena stop that thing from happening? Like when you flick on a light switch and you're like, I don't get any of this. This is stupid. Bad example. Right? Like, does that stop the light from coming on? Even when we believe we know, it's not even close to enough to do anything about much of what happens in the world. Understanding how electricity works might help you to be like a pretty good electrician, but let's be honest, we don't really know why these things happen. So much as that sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And other details, but like when we really get to a core, there's not much we are actually understanding about why these things are taking place. And clearly, regardless of that understanding, it's still happening. Maybe the point here is that we really have no business demanding answers about things we have no influence over. Maybe there's something intrinsic to our role as humans and our lack of knowledge. So, let's talk about another Bible story. I know. What is this? Seminary? I want to talk about the story of Adam and Eve and the apple or whatever. Everyone, you know, we all know it. God makes the world, and it's like, oh, let's get a little experimental and try our hand at something a little spicier. Let's make things that are kind of like us, right? So God makes all this stuff, right? And in that, God decides to make a person and name them after the earth, with the intention of making this person like God. But then they realize, hey, we're a they, and that's not a they. Let's make them a they, since we're trying to make something that's kind of like us. So they put the dude to sleep and take a part of him and make it into a lady. So one day, the lady's chilling, being naked, and this talking serpent is like, sup, hey, come here, I want to chat. And she's like, oh, hey, what's up? And it's like, oh, you know, nothing much, but, you know, I was just wondering, wondering? Yeah, I heard God talking to you, and I was just like, yeah? I was just wondering if what? If God really said you guys can't eat from any tree in the garden. Oh, no, we can. It's just not the tree in the middle of the garden. That one is bad or whatever. We can't eat from it. We can't even touch it, I think. We'll die or whatever that is. What? That's crazy. Cool. I thought you guys couldn't eat anything, and I was like, what? But I'm glad to hear you can eat. Yeah. But you won't die, right? What? You said, God said you would die. You won't die. Really? Oh, yeah. I heard, you didn't hear this from me, that God doesn't want you guys to eat from the tree because you'll actually become like God. You'll have knowledge of good and evil or whatever. Oh. Yeah. But you didn't hear that from me. So of course she's interested now, and she sees the tree doesn't look bad, and she could gain wisdom, so she eats it, and she gives some to her partner. Then of course things didn't go so well. They gained something, all right, but what is it? Okay, we've already been in this area with me before, but just go with me. Help me just stay along so I can build my case for what I think is happening when these first proto-humans ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Also, let's talk about this name, right? Which is a mouthful. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's something interesting here to unpack. It is not the tree of good and evil. They did not eat from this tree and become good/evil. This is a tree that bestows a specific type of knowledge, good and evil. Before having their eyes opened, this was not a reality they were privy to. They were naked, without shame, and seemingly unaware of any of the typical baggage that nakedness brings. I would argue that they were made aware of a certain kind of dualism about the nature of things in the world. Maybe before Adam saw the woman, he just thought, wow, hot. That was the end of that. There's no reason for him to evaluate the world around him, his thoughts or actions, and attribute some sort of moralistic value to it. Things just were. They were with God. But now they see their nakedness and think, crap, I'm naked. Is this okay? I think this isn't okay. And here's where my argument might get a little spicy. I'm going to say that this is the knowledge that causes them to experience their first encounter with suffering. They were literally fine moments ago. What has changed? They know. And not just anything, but moralistic dualism. Thing bad or thing good. And I just love God's response to this. They're running around, freaking out, making clothes. And God is like, where y'all at? And Adam's like, oh, I heard you. I'm not wearing any clothes, and I thought that might be kind of weird. And God's like, who told you you were naked? In other words, how is it that you know? And this is the crux of the human problem. I think that there are things that we aren't really built to know. But now we do. So now what? Obviously, we all know. There's no really going back to not knowing. And knowing causes suffering, whether that's an intimate understanding of how things work or your lack of understanding of how things work. And maybe you're not convinced, right? Which I get that. That makes sense. I think for a lot of people, knowing helps ground you. It gives you a sense of understanding in this world. And this really isn't like a critique of general knowledge. I think knowledge is important. Wisdom is a biblical virtue. So don't read this as me saying like, this isn't like a case against learning or anything. But there is something to be said about how quickly understanding and knowledge can go to this place of moral conviction, right? Even something mundane can become a battleground for moral conviction. One time in 2011, Chrissy Teigen tweeted some really nasty tweets about a 16-year-old. F her! Don't buy her cookbook. Actually, liking the musical Hamilton isn't cool or interesting. Having a black man play a historically known slave owner is not woke. Lin-Manuel Miranda is bad, actually. If you don't believe in COVID-19 and continue to wear a mask, you do not care about the health and safety of others. If you don't tell people about Jesus, you either don't know him or you hate everyone around you. Historical orthodoxy. You get it. There's something that happens within our brains that takes the knowledge that we gain and infuses it with intrinsic value. I think that for whatever reason, we believe this lie that when we receive knowledge, it stays objective, like free from any bias or agenda or meaning. We know in some ways this isn't true, but this idea of the knowledge we have as being truth kind of creeps into this space where we claim our perceptions have nothing to do with anything, nothing to do with how you were raised or the environment that you're in, or even how that truth was pitched to you, right? Facts don't care about your feelings. And there's a sliver of truth in this statement. But not really in the way it's usually weaponized against people. I do think facts don't care about your feelings. They also don't care about your moral convictions or the depth of your understanding. In fact, much of the truths of this world not only don't give a damn about you at all, but you are completely inconsequential to. And if that's true, what is the attachment that's happening? If truth doesn't need us, does that mean that we need truth? But what is truth? Now, this might be more high level again, but just follow with me. You've already made it this far. Going back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think it's easy for us to make subconscious assumptions that this is the highest level of all truths. But is that true? Or is it more likely that this is the kind of truth that is accessible to us as humans? Some like to talk about God being in a realm that is distinctly outside of our realm of understanding. God is so radically different than who we are and lives in a realm that is outside of what we experience. And for the most part, I get behind that school of thought. For me, God lives outside of human understanding. What we know about God has either told us or allowed us to have experiences about God. But these experiences are just small pieces of who God is. They are pieces of who God has chosen to reveal about himself individually. No one person has experienced the full entirety of God. God, in some senses, is, well, not in some senses, God is truth in its purest form. And for me, that means that truth in its purest form will never be fully known in its entirety. But as humans, we have a tendency to grasp on to what we glean as truth with an iron grip, not recognizing it as just a mere aspect of truth. It becomes a capital T truth, absolute truth. As soon as we do that, we're incapable of not assigning some amount of morality to that. I truly believe that it is intrinsic to the human understanding and the ways that we've learned to differentiate things in this world. We cannot define something as truth without investing moralistic meaning to it. And because of this dualistic paradigm we've inherited, our truth becomes good, and everything that stands against it becomes evil. Our position hardens over solid, concrete, certain. Do you remember the second definition of certainty I introduced? This is the process I'm talking about. What if when Adam and Eve ate the fruit from the tree, they received a very specific kind of knowledge, a knowledge that was not complete, a fragment of the full truth? But because human limited perspective, we're not really able to see things any other way. Isn't that also literally the point of Job? Bring it full circle. See, Job knows. He knows God. He knows how God works. He knows what he has and hasn't done. And based on all those things that he knows what is happening to him is wrong. Therefore, God must be the one who is wrong. Or, at the very least, calls wrong good. And then Job's friends argue with him about it because, well, they know too. And what they know is that God is not wrong. Therefore, Job must be wrong. The catch is they're literally both wrong, right? That's the end of the story. And they're wrong because their scope of understanding is far too limited. And this is the human condition. In the book of Job, there's an attempt to show what wisdom looks like. Wisdom is understanding that the depth of human knowledge is as shallow as a shot glass. And maybe, just maybe, knowing that will cause us to pause in our attempts to make hasty conclusions about the nature of things in this world, about God. Maybe instead of holding tightly with a closed fist to what we know, we could hold truth more loosely, understanding that we could really only ever grasp a tendril of it in the first place. So, cool. We get that human perspective is limited and God knows everything or whatever. What's the point of all of this? Just another thing to know? Hopefully not. Mainly, my goal in pointing this out is for it to change the way that we as Christians live our lives. When Adam and Eve seized the fruit from the tree for themselves, they were trading a worldview that was based in trust in God in spite of their ignorance for the ability to hold the weight of moral knowledge for themselves. The beautiful thing that we believe has been done in Jesus is that we've been reconciled back to God. And we can once again be in the space where we don't have to hold that for ourselves. we can return that power back to the one who makes the final ruling on all things. This is extremely freeing, at least it has been for me. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of suffering. My favorite topic, but Human suffering, in a lot of ways, tends to be people's largest impediment to accepting the existence of God. Within their minds, they think about what God would be like, and because we only have ourselves to go by, we end up using ourselves as a template for God. And when what we see in the world doesn't line up with what we think should happen, or it's not as good or as bad or whatever as we think it should be, we tend to write the entire idea of God off. Again, it's completely contingent upon our scope of knowledge. But also, pain is awful. People experience things that are utterly atrocious. We cling to certainty because it acts as a salve to the pain we constantly live in. But kind of like someone who comfort eats, our certainty feels good for the moment, but it's far from a healing response. Accepting the pain of life, of knowing, is recognizing that I'm never really going to know why anything painful has ever happened to me. I'm never really going to see the full picture of what's happening. Not in the everything happens for a reason, faux positivity sort of way, but like in a real, literally I cannot see all of the moving parts sort of way. I believe that everyone has a free will, and because of that, there are repercussions that go way beyond the scope of what we could have ever even considered. And we're made to be impacted by each other. We're made to be like the one who made us, united. So of course the actions of others affect me. Intrinsically, they were meant to. But how foolish of me to think that I could ever see the full picture of what's happening. But I don't have to. I trust that God does. And when that becomes enough, I can rest assured in any circumstance. At the beginning of this conversation, I asked you about what place certainty had within the life of a Christian. I was trying to be kind in my definition because, if I'm honest, what I really think is the way that certainty functions within the life of a Christian is just kind of pure idolatry. Just for a moment, I want you to think about the state of the U.S. and how the church is responding to our increased political polarization, major cultural unrest, the destabilization of the American empire. It's possible there are groups of Christians who are directly attempting to tackle these things, but for the most part, at least around me, I see the church sort of floundering at best. I think it makes sense for the non-Christian to be hugely affected by these moments. But why is the church? I've heard more talk in the last 4 years of the church becoming illegal, or fear of the downfall of the church in the face of this kind of tumultuous cultural moment. And I get why the world is panicked about the uprootings of our societal norms. But again, why is the church? Part of the issue we're seeing in our churches is that we've actually substituted following God for certainty. But again, why? Let's go back to the Impressionists. They were making something that nobody had before, just trying their hand at an idea that came to them. And now, at this point in time, they're fully celebrated within like the Western artistic canon. Gosh, like seriously, you could go into a Walmart and pick up an Impressionist painting, it feels like. For many of us, the early church is lifted as this ideal to seek after, a constantly elusive goal that seems to be out of reach for the modern American church, at the very least, despite its earnest efforts. It is in the striving and missing that there seems to be a common thread for many who are trying to really recapture that Acts church, gotta go back to the Church of Acts. There is the early pioneer that is exalted as the paradigm of genuine expression. Often these groups were looked upon with disdain within their times, and only in retrospect have they found acclaim. It's as if hindsight is the only way authenticity can be spotted by the masses. And with this hindsight comes waves of those trying to recapture what has since been lost from the good old days. So what tends to then happen is that people look at whatever time period, whether it be these Impressionists making authentic art or the early church trying to avoid persecution and seeing a real move of God. They look at these things and they say, how do we create rules essentially around this behavior to try and kind of artificiate and replicate this experience? And I think that there's something that happens when humans work to define absolutes. It immediately flattens what was once full and vibrant. It, in effect, creates an idol. What is idolatry then? Idolatry, by my definition, is the objectification of the divine and the deification of an object. But aren't we supposed to be certain about God, about doctrines, orthodoxy? Yes and no. For me, I think there's one thing we can be certain of as Christians, and that's God. Do we know all aspects of God? I'm gonna say no. I'm not terribly interested in getting in the weeds with this because it literally goes against my point and some of my actual beliefs about God. What about doctrines? I'm gonna say no. I think that the purpose of doctrine is admirable. But even within a group of 10 Christians who confess to believe the same statement have wildly different beliefs about that statement. Do I think that doctrinal statements are useless? No. But they are not the foundation of our beliefs. I don't think they could ever function that way. I keep seeing in the churches and organizations around me this sort of frenzied attempt to seize back the power they perceive themselves to be losing in this moment. And a lot of them are using the term historic orthodoxy as a way to do this. Oftentimes, without even making an attempt to define it. Yeah, let me just say this right now. The fact that people just say historic orthodoxy as if it's some unanimous, synonymous phrase is like the biggest giveaway that this concept is being exalted to the place of God. Because of course, when people say historic orthodoxy, they want to use it as a shield to not be clear about what they're actually trying to say, only to maintain the appearance of absolute truth. Sidebar. No one in these circles seems to care that to this day, historic orthodoxy has, as a whole, never included Black and brown churches, and just let alone countless other marginalized perspectives, but I digress. The thing about idols that give themselves away is that there's no room for real discussion. You'll always reach a point in the conversation where it can't go any further. You either accept truth or you're lost. Praying God will get you on the right path. Does this sound familiar? At the end of the day, Christians really need to reconcile the fact that walking with God is a terribly uncomfortable run into the literal unknown. It's terrifying, especially initially. And we have to stop selling this like it's some sort of shift into the good life. It is a good life, but it is completely counter to everything we have ever experienced up until accepting Christ. And we have to wake up if we're going to help people recover from when their idol fails them. We either shatter our idols or they will shatter us. But we can't help others if we're being shattered as well. We have to unclench our hands and allow truth to fully teach us what it has for each of us. And we need every single one of us to do that. We can't be picking fights just because people don't believe the exact same things as me. Maybe they see something that you don't. Maybe you guys can have a dialogue about it. Maybe you can hold things in such a way where you can have firm conviction about something, but also hold space for another opinion, right? God forbid. We have to learn to live our lives with God, running full speed into uncertainty.